You're a coach or whether you're a coach or a student, the place to begin whenever you see a new topic come out, and of course we'll all have the spring topic coming out in sometime in December, and you'll have this opportunity to go through this process all over again. The best place to start is in analyzing the topic is to think overall about what you know and what you don't know about the resolution. So first of all, notice with the wording of the resolution, there's no agent. That's very common in Lincoln-Douglas debate because we're focusing on values. But even though there's not an agent, very often the resolution is limited to the United States or to the state of Texas or to some group of countries. But in this case, it is not, which means there will be affirmative and or negative teams that will focus on the United States and others that will focus on developing countries, et cetera. So we could be talking about the US, or we could be talking about any other nation or group of nations. The challenge in any resolution, and I'm kind of reading to you from the slide, is to evaluate whether the instances cited by the affirmative, and on this topic, I think those are likely to be US based, are more important than the instances cited by the negative. And the better negative side of this topic will be ones that will focus on developing countries, as we'll talk about as we go along. But in every Lincoln-Douglas resolution, there is an implied, whether the resolution says it or not, there's an implied on balance. So we know that there are going to be some advantages to resource extraction, and we know there are going to be some disadvantages to resource extraction, but we're always weighing, as this resolution asks us to do, what's more important. And if your debaters can establish that their side, whether it be affirmative or negative, the instances that they cite are more vital or more important than the other contestants, then they may well win. So let's think through the wording of the topic. Starts out with when in conflict. And this kind of gives away a game in the sense that it implies that there are some instances where environmental protection and resource extraction are not in conflict. But we're not talking about those instances here. So, for example, a negative debater on this resolution might well play the game if the affirmative wants to talk about fracking, a little slice of the policy topic, which I think will be likely on this resolution. Negative debater can argue, well, that's not really in conflict with environmental protection because they've probably got a lot of evidence on the negative. If you don't have some, I'm going to share some with you a little later, that will say, hey, fracking actually helps the environment. It helps us do better vis-a-vis global warming. And there's a lot of that evidence out there. So the negative would say, don't talk to us about fracking. That's not an instance where environmental protection and resource extraction are in conflict. We should be talking about our instances on the negative, which are more likely to be developing countries. So we also have the word ought in the resolution. And whenever the Lincoln-Douglas Wording Committee words resolutions, as Jana knows, we sometimes have big debates about the word ought, because ought normally implies a normative obligation. This imposes a greater burden on the affirmative than if we didn't have that word in the resolution. And in a way, it gives something of a presumption to the negative, because it means the affirmative team needs to not only show that, hey, environmental protection may be damaged in some way by resource extraction, but that there's also a moral obligation. There's a normative obligation to not engage in that. So it's not a huge additional burden for the affirmative, but it is a little one. And in a way, it kind of gives the presumption to the negative whenever you have that word ought in the resolution. Then we have the word environmental protection. And what do we mean by environmental protection? Well, it can mean different things to different people. Let's talk about one big category of difference. So for example, in the 2008 book by Tim Forsyth, professor at the London School of Economics, in the book Companion to Development Studies, he says we should distinguish between two kinds of environmentalism. There's brown environmentalism, which means really poor living conditions for people. Like, do we have safe housing? Do we have safe drinking water? Do we have proper sanitation? But then we also have green environmentalism, which really focuses more on the natural environment beyond just drinking water and housing and sanitation, but biodiversity, deforestation, climate change. So one of the issues that will be involved in this debate on this resolution is sometimes you'll have one team focusing more on brown environmentalism, whereas the other team is focusing more on green environmentalism. We'll talk about how that plays out when we talk about some case options later on. Then we have this comparative term in the resolution. Whenever you have a Lincoln-Douglas value topic, which all Lincoln-Douglas topics should be value topics, you have to have a comparative term. So in this resolution, the comparative phrase is take precedence over. So the environment, concerns about the environment should take precedence over environmental extraction. What does that mean? Well, on the web, if you look at the Macmillan Dictionary, precedence means a more important position or status than something else, the right to a more important position or status. So one is more important than the other. It's what we're really talking about. And then what do we mean by resource extraction? Well, if you look at definitions of this term, they're all over the place. There are a lot of resources and a lot of different kinds of resources. Food is a resource. So we could be talking about agriculture. We could be talking about the way that agriculture is done harms the environment. And because there's a crossover from the policy topic, there will be affirmative debaters who will choose to do that. We could be talking about water. We extract water from deep reservoirs, the Ogallala Reservoir, the Edwards Reservoir here in Texas. And there's concern about that. We're depleting underground reservoirs. We're depleting our water resources and therefore harming the environment. And Jana, we had a discussion on the LD Wording Committee, as you know, about whether we should select a resolution that picks a slice of the policy topic or not. We didn't really think about this one as taking a slice out of the policy topic, but in fact, when you think about it, it does. Most obviously, fossil fuel extraction, getting coal out of the ground, extracting oil, oil out in the deep ocean, fracking. All of those are instances of resource extraction. Fishing, if you do research on that term, what is meant by resource extraction, fishing and hunting are types of resource extraction. So overfishing could be an issue. So notice the overlap to those of you that do any policy topic stuff, notice the overlap to the policy topic, which is a water topic, but water topic becomes, as we've discussed with the policy debaters, also an energy topic, also an agriculture topic, also an oceans topic, where we're talking about overfishing and so on. All of that is part of the policy topic, the national policy topic that the UIL also uses. So how do you analyze then what you have to do in Lincoln-Douglas debate? We talk about stock issues in policy debate, but there are also stock issues in Lincoln-Douglas debate. And to the extent that anyone talks about stock issues in a value resolution, it would be these three. What is the core value or the most important value that's in play, according to either the affirmative or negative case? Traditionally, on a value topic, you begin with that. What's the value that you think is the most important that's in play with this particular resolution? And then once you have the value, what's the criterion for the value? How will we know if that value has been achieved or not? And then the case begins in earnest. What the case contentions or arguments do is to try to show how the criterion is met by your side of the resolution, whether that's the affirmative or the negative. So those are the three elements of any value resolution. What's the core value? What's the criterion for that value? And then what contentions or arguments apply the criterion to your side of the resolution? So what are some possible core values that are in play with this resolution? Well, this is only a partial list, but preservation of human life is always up there. So if we're talking about climate change, for example, I mean, you have environmentalists that worry about we could have major loss of life with climate change around the world. Safety is a value. If we degrade the environment, then safety comes into play. Even cost-benefit analysis can be of value. There are those who argue that's the way that we should make decisions. What are the costs and benefits? The common good is a popular value, goes all the way back to some of the early Christian philosophers. Poverty reduction, justice. If you look historically at Lincoln Douglas resolutions, about half of them will actually use some variation of the term justice in the resolution. What would be just or whatever, but this resolution doesn't give you a value. It's up to the debaters to decide what their value will be, but justice can be one of those values, as we'll talk about later. You might not think that national security is a big value, but it could easily be for the negative on this topic. If the affirmative is, for example, going to argue that the United States needs to go away from fracking in order to save the environment, the negative might argue that that raises national security concerns, because if we go out of business in fossil fuels, in examples like fracking or whatever, we put back in business, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the countries in the Middle East that, will now be the ones controlling world energy. Whereas the United States, because of fracking, we have near energy independence. So national security could be a value, especially for the negative on this topic. Vladimir Putin, for example, is looking for a way to finance his military as he tries to rebuild the old Soviet empire. But that's been a problem because fracking has so driven down the price of natural gas and even of oil, its competitor, that it's almost cut in half what was the world price of oil. And that's hurt the Russian economy. You would put the Russian economy back in business if you banned fracking. And I know that this is not a policy topic. You're not saying that you should ban it, but that's the essence of an argument. If you say, well, environmental protection is the be-all, end-all. It's the most important thing that we need to pay attention to. We may be undermining U.S. national security by doing that. And obviously that would only be true for cases like affirmative cases that focus on the United States. Then what is a criteria for a value? Well, for any one of those values we talked about, we could stop and talk about different criteria by which they could be judged. But let me just use the example of justice. If we're talking about justice and we say that's our core value, how will we know if that's been achieved? So these are some of the ways that Lincoln Douglas debaters establish a criteria for a value like justice. One of them is Rawlsian justice, after John Rawls, the great Harvard philosopher, who's always talking about giving preference to the least advantaged among us, which in this case would be peoples of developing countries. Is it criminal justice, punishing the guilty? Is it environmental justice, preserving environmental quality? Is it procedural justice, meaning due process or giving people what they're due? Is it restorative justice, the duty to repair damage done, polluter pays, for example? And that will come into play on this topic as well. So let's talk about some possible affirmative case ideas. So you could just have affirmative debaters focusing heavily on United States examples and evidence drawn from the United States that talk about, the core value here could be preserving human life. The criterion for that value, criteria is the plural, but a livable environment is a precondition for preserving life. And then could focus on things like the damage done by coal extraction, by coal mining, the damage done by hydraulic fracturing. And that isn't necessary because renewable energy resources could replace fossil fuel use and not create that kind of damage. So because it's such an easy extrapolation from the policy topic, and because policy schools that have policy teams got a lot of this evidence available, very likely that there will be Lincoln Douglas cases that will focus on the harms, especially US-based harms of fossil fuel extraction. A second affirmative case idea is just climate directly. Core value here could be safety. Slowing climate change is essential to safety. So there's certainly a lot of environmentalists who argue that global warming is the greatest threat to human civilization, that it's going to cause environmental collapse if we don't get serious about it, and present evidence that climate change issues are upon us. The evidence is clear and convincing. Global warming especially will devastate developing countries with sea rise and so on. So that's another case idea. Another case idea is the resource curse, and this requires a little explanation. And this can apply to any kind of resource extraction. So there's a big term out there in the economic literature, Dutch disease, that I need to stop and explain. It actually comes from, example, with the Dutch back in the 1970s. Term was coined by environmentalists by the Economist magazine. When that publication and economists noticed that when the Netherlands discovered huge natural gas deposits in the North Sea and began extracting them, lo and behold, it didn't help the Dutch economy, it hurt the Dutch economy. How is that even possible? Well, what economists discovered, and thus the term Dutch disease, is that this newfound wealth increased the value of the Dutch guilder as international corporations moved in, bought major parts of this asset. And what happened is it caused a rise in their currency vis-a-vis the world currencies. And it hurt every other industry. The oil and gas industry did well, but it hurt every other part of the Dutch economy because the value of the guilder increased, and it hurt all other exports. And their unemployment rose by 500% within just a few years. Total capital investment in the country dropped, even though oil and gas exploration increased. Every other part of the economy was harmed. So what economists often do when they talk about what happens in developing countries when some new major oil and gas deposit is discovered, or the example in Africa with diamonds, for example, the blood diamond, that whole thing, is this major resource. What happens? Well, first of all, it brings in foreign corporations. It brings in a lot of foreign money to that particular aspect of the economy, but it may hurt every other part of the economy as a result of corruption, as a result of the promotion of violence, and because of Dutch disease, because it changes it hurts other products other than that one that's been discovered because it changes the currency value. So that's kind of an interesting argument, and one that if you do quite a bit of research on Dutch disease, it's kind of an interesting little window into this topic. So let's talk about some negative case ideas. And certainly I didn't exhaust all the affirmative possibilities. You could talk about water, you could talk about hunting, you could talk about fishing, you could talk about overfishing. There's so much else you could talk about. But again, keep in mind, this is not quite like policy debate where, okay, so let's say you've got an overfishing case and you talk about how that resource extraction is really hurting the environment and hurts resources. In Lincoln-Douglas debate, the negative team might be able to win the debate without even talking about overfishing much, because what their real argument is, that's such a small part of resource extraction. We're talking about a major part over here in developing countries that, you know, it's a much more representative example of the harms or the benefits in this case of resource extraction than your example. So whereas in policy debate, well, you kind of have to talk about whatever the affirmative wanted to talk about if you're negative. In Lincoln-Douglas debate, well, you might have to talk about that a little bit, but you get to do your own case in Lincoln-Douglas debate. And so the case that you present, one of the things you can just argue is our example is bigger than yours. It's more important. It's more representative of the whole of what we're talking about. So there isn't quite the same advantage in Lincoln-Douglas debate to picking on some little thing that there is in policy debate. So a first negative case idea, just reducing poverty. So why is poverty reduction a core value? Well, as a negative debater could argue, this is the #1 goal when the UN lays out its Millennium Development Goals, MDG, as you'll see it in the United Nations literature. Poverty reduction is #1. And so the criteria for poverty reduction, whatever will bring more money for the poor in the developing world. And so if you're negative, you're going to argue resource extraction reduces poverty. This is the best way to reduce poverty, you're going to argue, because it's trade versus aid. So the old idea in the development community is, oh, let's send them foreign aid. Let's give them money. But trade is a far better way to deal with poverty than is aid for a number of reasons. So, you know, for a developing country to develop its resources, that's the best way to deal with poverty, is your argument on the negative. And if you're using this case on the negative and the affirmative is focused on the United States and, you know, whatever it is that they want to focus on, the United States fracking, et cetera, all the things we talked about with that first affirmative case. In the negative, you're going to argue resource extraction in the United States is not really in conflict with environmental protection. How do we know that? Because in the United States, air has become cleaner, water has become cleaner. We are, in the United States, we are leading the world, as you would argue on the negative, in greenhouse gas reductions. How is all of that possible? It's possible because the United States, with increased wealth, is able to have a changeover to renewable energy resources, and also even just defending fracking. Why is fracking helpful to the environment? It may surprise you that there are a lot of good negative arguments as to why that's true, because it replaces coal with natural gas. Natural gas burns way more clean than does coal. And there are many environmentalists even who argue that natural gas is the reason that the United States the increased use of natural gas because of fracking is the reason that the United States has been able to reduce its impact on the environment and is leading the world in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So the negative argument here is, don't talk to us about the United States. The United States has some of the cleanest environment in the world. You know, water is better, air is cleaner, et cetera. Where it's at is in the developing world. That's the concern. And in the developing world, the bigger question is poverty reduction. And so that's why they should be developing their resources. Resource development is for them more important. And I indicate there that I'll provide a link to you. Lincoln Douglas debaters, you probably don't have time to go out and do all the negative work on answering all of these kind of affirmative case arguments that I was just talking about. So I'm going to put in the chat for you a link. And that's about a 150-page brief set, just answering all kind of arguments that affirmative teams may make about water, about agriculture, about fracking, about coal, et cetera. They're all negative arguments that can be used to answer a lot of the things that policy debaters want to focus on. If I'm a Lincoln Douglas debater, and whether I'm affirmative or negative, I'm probably going to focus away from the policy topic, focus away from the United States, because, you know, if you happen to be debating a team that has a big policy component, you probably don't want to play that game. You'd probably rather play away from it, which means let's talk about what happens in the developing world, not what happens in the United States. But those briefs that I've given you the link to, they'll give you kind of a leg up in answering a lot of those policy related topics. So if you can at least blunt those arguments, hey, fracking is destroying the environment. Well, no, it isn't. You know, water is being polluted in the United States and it's whatever. Well, no, it's not that big of a deal. So that's what a lot of those briefs, and there's an index to them at the beginning, are designed to help you with. So, Annette, you say, I can't see the links. Does your school block Dropbox by any chance? Is anybody able to click that and find the... Can somebody try that and see if you can get to that brief set?
Rich, I think we just don't see your link copied into chat because I don't see it either.
Okay. Let me try it again.
There we go. I see it now. Does everybody else see it? Got it.
The message I sent before was voice for theater for this. Are you able to, does that link work for you? Okay, and that says it works. So a second negative area on climate change, and this could counter the affirmative climate change. So those responsible for harm should be the ones responsible for redress. This is a restorative justice criteria. So the value would be justice. The criterion is essentially restorative justice argument. Polluter pays. Those who are responsible for it should be the ones dealing with it. So that first contention is worded wrong there. It should say developed countries, the big countries, are the ones primarily responsible for climate change. Developing countries have the right to develop just as wealthy nations have done. So to tell developing countries, you have no right to use the resources that are contained in your country because we're too worried about climate change. That's essentially an effort to just lock in the status quo, to say, okay, we're ahead of you. We got ahead of you by using all of our coal and our oil, and we want you to stay just where you are. We don't want you to extract any of your resources, because if you do, you're going to drive climate change. By the way, in the links that I sent you, there are some arguments just saying that the best way to address climate change is with adaptation and so on. But it's so the key argument here, it's fundamentally unjust to require developing countries to forego resource extraction in order to pay for the cost of environmental protection. They have a right to develop their resources. And then this third argument, this is pretty controversial. You should research it yourself. It's certainly a very two-sided debate. And for people who know this debate well, there's a lot of objection to the environmental Kuznets curve, but I'd like to talk about it. This argument, and here the value could be the common good, which is really a utilitarian in value, the greatest good for the greatest number. And again, the argument here is poverty reduction needs to be the first priority of developing countries. And the argument here is extract your resources and understand that as you advance, as you deal with poverty, environmental protection will take care of itself. That's the argument of the environmental Kuznets curve. It's named after Simon Kuznets, who was the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics back in 1971. The argument here is, look what's happened in the developed countries. They used resource extraction, et cetera. As they develop, as they become richer, they then develop both the interest and the capability to protect the environment. So how is it true, for example, that in the United States, the water has become cleaner over the last 50 years? The air has become cleaner over the last 50 years. It's because we have developed the capability, and as people move out of poverty, instead of having their primary concerns be just the immediate survival, they become more interested in preserving the environment. And as their wealth accumulates as a country, they develop the ability to protect the environment. So this argument is resource extraction, because it adds to wealth, becomes the means for protecting the environment. So, you know, when a person lives in poverty, they don't have either the interest or the means to improve the environment around them. So those are some examples of affirmative and negative cases. And those are pretty much all the cases that I have for you. So discussion, questions. How can I help you?
You can either unmute or you can throw your question in the chat. That's fine.
Have I given you some ideas about how to approach each new topic as it comes out in terms of topic analysis, how to think about a new topic? Lincoln Douglas debaters spend a lot more time defining terms than policy debaters do. We often expect to.
Rich, Sophia is asking if you could share your screen again and go back to the second negative slide.
I will. Is that the right one?
Sophia, is that the one you need?
Can you see it?
Yes, that's it.
I've lost my chat. Let me get it back. What question did you have, Sophia?
Sophia, are you unmuted?
Or you just wanted to read what I had there? Two new messages.
How many of you have been to a tournament already and used this topic?
Well, how's it going for you? What kind of arguments have you been hearing?
See if I can help unmute them. I don't know. Can you guys unmute yourself?
We've been to one tournament with this topic. We heard a lot of developing countries things, and some poverty reduction as well.
Didn't hear very much about US stuff, like the policy topic stuff?
No, not really. It was pretty broad.
Okay. Well, I think that's actually some of the more interesting parts of the topic. And again, I would advise you, if you're a Lincoln Douglas debater, and especially if you don't have a heavy policy component to your team, that's where I would stay as much as possible, away from the United States-based arguments. You're staying on ground that's more specific to, not more specific, because this topic does include the United States, potentially, but it's probably better winning ground for you, shall I say. So I see, how do we choose a core value? Well, as you think backwards from, what do you think is most important about the resolution? So, you know, when you read the resolution, let's say if you're preparing an affirmative case, so you're going to defend environmental protection as primary. Why are you going to do that? Are you primarily going to focus on a climate change argument? Are you going to focus on, you know, what are you going to do? And then think backwards from that. Well, why is that the most important? What value does that relate back to? So, again, I don't know the audience of the particular folks that we have here, but Lincoln Douglas in its original design, and we still think in UIL Lincoln Douglas debate, should primarily be value focused. If you've heard the term progressive Lincoln Douglas debate, which I don't view as, you know, progressive, but probably a better term for that is policy Lincoln Douglas. So focuses more on plans, focuses more on the kind of things that policy debaters do. And I love policy debate. Policy debate is great. But Lincoln Douglas debate is not supposed to be policy debate. It's supposed to be more value focused, where if you participate in Lincoln Douglas debate, you learn more about core values, about the philosophical base for different values. So that's why we like to keep it value focused. What is the value that's at issue here with the argument that you want to make? If you want to argue that climate change, dealing with climate change is a primary value, why do you say that? What's the original value? Is it the protection of human life? Is it justice? Is it safety? Is it common good? There's an overlap with all of those values. But we published something at Baylor Briefs called the Value Debate Handbook, which is not focused on any particular topic, but just tries to go over all of the possible values. And I don't know, Janet, do you still make available somewhere on the website that crazy thing that you had me do last year, going over the history of philosophy and all the different philosophical views and so on. Is that still out there and available?
Yes, it is. It is.
What Jana had me do last year, just because we didn't have anything better to do during COVID, is to just kind of go back through the history of philosophy. Like, what are values that come out of the great philosophy of the ages? And, you know, so I don't know, I spent about an hour doing that, looking back to Plato and Aristotle and up through Locke and Hume and Bacon and etc.
Well, and that's really a foundation of preparing your debaters for Lincoln Douglas, is get them familiar with different philosophers. That's why I asked Rich if he would do that, so that he could highlight some of the more common ones that are actually used many times in a Lincoln Douglas debate round. You want to make sure that those students go in prepared, understanding some of the popular philosophers that are often used. So you may have a question of Rich today about that. You heard him mention one of his cases being utilitarianism. And so if you're not familiar with that, that's certainly a very common term that you would want your debaters to explore.
Right.
I have a question.
Okay.
First, I'd like to say, no, I'm echoing. Y'all hear the echo?
There's a little echo, but I can understand.
Okay. But first, I'd like to say that at the debate that I went to with the students, the debaters were using quite a few of the cases that you presented for both the affirmative and the negative. So that's really good. I don't know if their coaches had listened to another speech that you gave or what, but that was really good. Now, I'm noticing that with the criteria that you're listing, it's not in the form of action words. Do you suggest that the students use action type words like increasing this or minimizing this? What do you suggest?
Well, the reason that I don't tend that direction is because I don't view Lincoln Douglas debate as policy debate. So you're not presenting a plan. I know a lot of Lincoln Douglas debaters do. That's, again, what has come to be called progressive Lincoln Douglas. And what they're really saying is we are progressing toward policy debate. And so they want to present a particular plan or a particular proposal. I don't see criteria as doing that. I see criteria as saying, just answering the question, how will we know if this value has been achieved? What are we looking for? And, and I'm using the word criteria plural. I should be using criterion singular, but what is it? Not just what is the value, but how will we know if it's been achieved? And then the contention should be focusing on that criterion. So if the criterion for safety, in case 2, what I have in front of you, if the value is safety and the criterion is slowing climate change, okay, well, how will doing what you propose, limiting resource extraction, accomplish that? Tim says, I prefer to let the value and criterion evolve through and after research and not select a value just from the resolution, even though the resolution may dictate a particular value. Yeah, here's what I think about that, Tim. If the resolution specifies a value, you kind of have to use that value, and then you're really only debating about the criterion. If you look back through the history of Lincoln Douglas resolutions, either at the UIL level or at the NSDA level, about half of them will specify a value. Sometimes it's democracy. most commonly it's just or justice. And if the resolution specifies that, you don't really have to talk about what the core value should be because the resolution is laying it for you. But the resolution that we have here does not specify a core value. And so it leaves it totally up to the debaters to decide what is the value that we think is the most important. So I don't know, when we're in wording committee sessions for the Lincoln Douglas resolutions, we do think about that. Like, should the resolution specify a value? Like, should we ask debaters to focus on the value of democracy and what better advances that? Or should we leave it totally open? This resolution leaves it totally open. So Janet, can you answer the question that Miriam asked? Where is the link to that philosopher thing available?
Oh, I'll have to go in and pull it up. You should be able to find it on the debate webpage.
Somewhere on the UIL debate webpage.
If not, it's on the YouTube for UIL. If you're able to get into that, and we have certainly given you lots of links to that for the virtual super conference, the section of the programming that we have on the Student Activities Conference webpage. Take a look at that and see if you can get into the UIL YouTube. And if you can find all kinds of presentations on that.
Other questions? There's been several good ones. Whoever asked me to go back to the first and second case slide, did you get what you wanted? I mean, the first case idea, this is really just the slices of the policy topic.
What kind of reaction, what kind of response have you had from your debaters? Do they, are they enjoying this topic? Are they excited about it? I know when we first released it in August, we got a lot of very, very positive feedback. I'm curious to know, after students have gotten a hold of it and gotten to a few tournaments, how they're feeling. Any reaction, any response you'd like to share with us?
Shruti, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, Shruti is a student of mine who has joined. So I'm gonna let her take the lead on that question. Do you mind, Shruti?
Yeah, no, that's all right. I was going to unmute and say something.
Very good.
From us, generally, when we first got the topic, a lot of us thought that it was like affirmative leaning just a little bit, because I think just on like first basis, we weren't really sure what to argue for the neg. And then we went to one competition and sort of just asking around and mingling with the other students. It seemed almost like neg was almost easier at some times. It's obviously like a balance a lot of the time, but I think initially we all thought that it was a little bit leaning towards the affirmative, but then arguing and like interacting with other schools made us realize that it was more even and made us enjoy the resolution a little bit more after competition, if that helps.
We really do work, that committee works very hard to try to make sure that there's a balance. We don't want it to lean one way or the other. So they really do work hard at it.
The reason that I suggested that negative on this topic is probably going to want to focus on developing countries is that's where the far stronger negative arguments are. You know, so just at a very surface level, to tell developing countries, you don't have the right to use the value of your resources like we did when, you know, as we developed in the United States or in developed countries. We want you to leave them in the ground. We want you to, you know, save the environment and whatever. Oh, sure. After you have, you know, for a century, extracted your resources and whatever, now you're telling us that we need to leave them alone because of climate change. Just the injustice of that, the impact of that on, okay, you're going to leave us in poverty then, et cetera. I mean, that's a kind of a core negative position on this topic.
I was going to ask a question regarding that case. I think that it's a really strong case, but I was wondering, because the resolution says when in conflict, I was wondering how that would, like, if the opposition said, like, when we're in conflict, the injustice sort of evens out, or it's not as important because we need to choose one over the other. So I was thinking about how I could defend my case if I ended up using contentions like that.
If you're negative, I would argue that the reason they're in conflict is because of the time difference. So yeah, the argument can be, okay, if we develop the resources, that will help the environment in the long run. That's the environmental Kuznets curve argument.
Mm-hmm.
But that time difference makes a big difference. Like right now, developing countries should not be saying, they are in conflict right now. In other words, the whole notion of the Kuznets curve is the development will have a short-term deterioration in the environment, but in the long term, it will help the environment. So yes, they are in conflict, but actually what's happened in developed countries provides the example. So, you know, London in the 1800s, you know, with the coal and all that kind of thing, was a dirty place to live. It's a beautiful place to live now. So it takes time, but to tell developing countries that they can't use their resources now because of concern about climate change or whatever, there's a time difference. So what they need to do right now is to use the value of their resources. And I think the argument you're hearing from the other team is, if you're saying that resource extraction will end up helping the environment in the long run, well, the important part of that phrase is in the long run. Right now, it will undermine the environment in the short term. In the long run, it will help it. But the reason that developing countries should continue to do that now is because of the priority given to other values other than, you know, environment, like poverty, like the value of development.
Thank you.
Have a good time at the open house, Tim.
He's got a long night ahead of him, doesn't he?
Anyone else?
So my kids would like me to say that they don't love this topic. They, out here behind the pine curtain, we kind of see ourselves as like the last bastion of like really UIL and not progressive at all. And they feel like it just feels really policy driven, and they don't like that.
Well, any resolution can be policy driven if the other team wants to try to make it that way. But notice there's no agent of action in this topic. And again, when you get another team trying to make this into a slice of the policy topic and presenting a plan, if you have a judge, you know, that cares about value debate, just bringing it back to even asking them the question in cross-examination, you know, well, what is the core value that you're focused on here, and so on. So if you have others in your area that value debate, you can get at those things, even though the other team may try to make this part of the current policy topic.
Every once in a while, we feel like there is a policy topic that allows us to write very much a value topic that parallels that. And we've had coaches say they really like when we can do that. There are times when we've examined it. We talk about it every year when we meet. And there are times when we don't feel like that can really happen. And we really don't. We really, Pam, don't want our LD topic to be policy in any way. But we felt like this was a policy topic that we could write a parallel to. And we thought maybe because of the struggle of the pandemic and how coaches were so exhausted that, and because their teams had been splintered because they hadn't been together, a lot of them, and they've done all these virtual tournaments, that maybe this really was a good year to try to write one that paralleled. We certainly in no way intended or believe anyway that it's policy driven, but I certainly respect your students' feelings. But I do know that it was a year where we consciously decided to do that. We've done it in the past, just now and then, not lately, but really and truly the pandemic also convinced us that maybe the fall was a good time to do that, where you're regrouping your kids, putting them back together as a squad, as a team, and that maybe that would get your LDers and your CXers working together better. I don't know about you, but sometimes that's a struggle. The CXers don't respect the LDers and the LDers don't like policy, right, Pam? So, you know, sometimes there's a real division between, even though they're all debaters, they are not crazy about one another and what the others do. So we had hoped that this might be a good thing.
And really, my advice to you is to try to push it into the developing world. That's where the key value issues are. And if you can just blunt the effort that other teams are going to make it US focused, I think that gets it into the value areas. That's why I kind of threw that brief set at you, because, you know, if you can answer some of the US based policy arguments and then make your own arguments in the developing world, you know, that's an area of this resolution that policy focused debaters are not going to want to live in. Anyone else?
Pam, thank you for that. Very honest. We like to hear those kinds of things. We want to take that back to the committee, you know, and we want to certainly address that. And I'm quite sure that if you had an LDer that wanted to email Dr. Edwards with their thoughts about that he would be happy to address that and maybe help them see a different side. Possibly not.
And I don't think that they're having any trouble bringing philosophy into it. They just feel neglected in general. They always accuse me of being a policy person, and I do have a policy brain. So, you know, a little friendly competition. And then my policy kids voted on the policy topic today. So they're especially feeling a little neglected today.
They vote for
Russia.
Okay. Well, that's a Texas topic, so we like that. Originated with coaches out at Big Spring.
And we think that would be a good topic. So good vote there. And it was very, very, very close last year. You know, it was on the final ballot last year as well. So lots going on in Russia. You heard Rich mention Putin in his discussion today. So
we voted for Russia last year too. So they were excited to see it again. So I really like the emerging tech topic, but my kids didn't like it.
And if any of you coaches in this meeting have not yet submitted your ballot, please do that. Got to have it this week. I've got to send that in to the National Federation. We really want as many coaches voting as possible.
So I stuck my email address in the chat. If you feel to email me with a particular argument or whatever and would like to pick my brain about it. I'd like to help in any way that I could.
All right. Well, we want to thank you. We know your days are long, and we do not take it lightly that you stayed extra today to listen to Dr. Edwards and to help your kids do even better on this LD topic. We will be releasing the spring topic in December. We officially say December 15th. We've been early the last few years, so I can't swear that we'll do that, but we certainly think we've got some good topics that are potential. And I will tell you that we work very, very hard that the spring topic is great for novices, but very challenging for varsity kids that have a lot of experience, and it definitely will be value laden. So watch the website, and also make sure that you have registered as a speech coach, because you'll get a personal email from me the moment that it goes up on the website. So you don't have to be emailing saying, hey, Jana, when's it coming out? I will send you an email and say it is now posted. So sometime in December, no later than the 15th. Any other questions before we sign off? Thank you guys so much, and kudos to Dr. Edwards, who does so much work for us, and thank you for the research and the development of arguments that you have given us today, Rich. We appreciate your time. I know you've taught all day too, so you're ready to be home. Thank you so much.
Happy to be here. Thanks, everyone.